In 1623, inside the golden walls of Topkapi Palace, the price of empire was measured not in gold, but in silence. It was the scream of a girl barely 15 that cut through marble corridors and vanished into official silence. We know the names of sultans, the victories of armies, the glory of dynasties. But who paid for that glory? Chronicles fall silent. Bones, ledgers, and forbidden notes whisper the rest. If you value the historical record, subscribe, because when the ledger closes, the bones still speak. That scream belonged to Princess Fatma Sultan, daughter of Sultan Ahmed. And it did not mark rebellion or battle. It was the moment a child's life was transformed into currency. Within the empire that stretched from Yemen to Hungary, daughters of the dynasty were never free agents of their own futures. They were pieces on the chessboard, moved by unseen hands, married not for love, but for treaties, alliances, and stability. For outsiders, the Ottoman harem shimmered as a place of luxury, perfumed gardens, silks, music, and poetry. But behind the screens, the truth was different. Every movement was watched, every gesture weighed, every breath subject to rules. More than 800 women lived under constant observation. Some were concubines brought from distant villages who might climb to influence if they captured the sultan's favor. But for royal daughters like Fatma, the game was fixed from the start. Their destiny was to serve as living contracts, their bodies pledged long before their voices ever formed words. That night in 1623, the scream was not an accident. It was the sound of a system working as designed, a ritual meant to break the will before marriage. Historians would later call it sacred training. But to the girls who endured it, it was indoctrination by humiliation, a rehearsal for a life of silence. This is where our story begins. Not with battles, not with sultans, but with the voice of a child trapped inside the most powerful palace in the world. What the chronicles erased, we will uncover step by step. Imagine entering Topkapi Palace, not as a guest, but as a prisoner of lineage. Rising above the Bosporus, the palace glittered with domes, gardens, and mosaics. From a distance, it looked like the crown jewel of empire. Inside it was also a cage, one lined with silk and perfumed with roses, but still a cage. Every door locked from the outside, every corridor watched by eunuchs, trained to notice even the slightest act of resistance. At its peak, the imperial harem held more than 800 women. To Europeans, writing from afar, it became the stuff of fantasy, a paradise of beauties, reclining on couches, whispering poetry into the sultan's ear. But the truth was harsher. The harem was not a sanctuary of love. It was a mechanism of control. Each woman, whether concubine captured in war or daughter born of royal blood, was reduced to her political utility. The empire turned women into living treaties, gifts, or tools of succession. Concubines brought from villages in the Caucasus or ports of the Black Sea might sometimes see fortune smile. They could learn music, embroidery, the art of conversation. If the Sultan favored them, chains could melt into crowns, their sons raised as princes. But for princesses like Fatma Sultan, there was no such gamble. They were not allowed to compete, to scheme, to climb. Their futures were decided the moment they drew their first breath. Their marriages sealed alliances, quieted rebellions, bought loyalty from generals too powerful to be ignored. Fatma's childhood reflected this paradox. Surrounded by scholars, she studied languages, astronomy, and poetry. She was praised in court records as radiant, brilliant, promising. Yet brilliance was a hollow currency in a system that valued obedience above all. Every lesson, every book, every fragment of joy existed under the shadow of inevitability. She would be given away. The machinery of the harem reinforced this silence. Eunuchs, many themselves taken as children and surgically mutilated to serve, acted as both guards and spies. Their presence reminded every girl that the empire's gaze never blinked. The chief eunuch controlled access to the sultan, the flow of information, even the fates of women inside. Meanwhile, the Valide Sultan, the sultan's mother, wielded immense power, turning the harem into a battlefield of influence, where whispers could topple rivals. For a young princess, these struggles were not games, but storms. She had no choice but to weather. Fatma grew up watching other women maneuver for power concubines, rising from obscurity alliances forged in secret rivalries, simmering behind polite smiles. She saw how women once enslaved could become formidable players while daughters of emperors remained pawns. Every procession, every ritual reminded her that she was less a child than a symbol, an emblem of dynasty wrapped in silk, destined for sacrifice. The cage of gold was not built of iron, but of rituals. Girls were taught how to bow, how to walk, how to lower their gaze at a precise angle. They learned 43 permitted words, a vocabulary of gratitude and apology, stripped of personal will. Fatma, even as a gifted child, felt her vocabulary shrinking into obedience. To speak freely was dangerous. To dream was useless. By the time she reached adolescence, whispers of her betrothal began. The chosen man was not a poet or scholar she admired, but Kara Mustafa Pasha, a battle-hardened commander 20 years older. For him, the marriage was a ladder. For her, it was a chain. The empire had already drafted her fate in invisible ink. And so the cage closed tighter. Gardens filled with jasmine and fountains concealed the truth. These were not gardens of leisure, but holding pens for royal daughters. Topkapı's marble halls glistened in sunlight. But behind them lay a machinery of silence so efficient, it erased centuries of suffering from official record. Fatma's world from the start was a paradox, celebrated as a jewel of empire, yet treated as property of the state. In that contradiction, the seeds of tragedy were already planted. In the Topkapı Palace, there was a cruel paradox. A slave girl, captured in the forests of the Caucasus, marched through the Crimean port of Kaffa, and sold in Istanbul's market's might. Through wit charm or sheer luck, one day become Haseki Sultan, the Sultan's favored consort and mother of princes. History remembers names like Hürrem Sultan, a woman once enslaved in Ukraine who became the most powerful figure in the empire. For concubines, the harem was a dangerous lottery, but it was at least a lottery in which some could win. For princesses, the daughters of the Sultan himself, there was no lottery at all. From their first breath, their futures were scripted into invisible ledgers of power, written not in ink, but in blood and flesh. They were not permitted the chance of rising or falling by intrigue. They were not players in the game. They were the game itself. Every Ottoman princess was born a coin of flesh minted for diplomacy. Unlike concubines, they could not aspire to win favor with the Sultan. They already belonged to him by birth. Their role was to be given away married to Pasha's governors or generals, not for love or even companionship, but to bind loyalty, seal alliances, or calm rebellions. Where treaties faltered, where loyalties wavered, a daughter could be sent as collateral. Her body and life used to purchase stability for the throne. Fatma Sultan's story was only one thread in this vast tapestry of calculated transactions. She was born in 1606, daughter of Sultan Ahmed IV and Kösem. Sultan, one of the most formidable women in Ottoman history. Chroniclers describe Fatma as gifted, radiant, quick, with languages able to converse in Persian and Arabic, to read poetry and debate philosophy. Yet, even in her brilliance, she was already trapped. For unlike concubines who studied seduction as a possible pathway to influence, Fatma studied astronomy and poetry, knowing these things would never protect her. Concubines were taught to dream. Princesses were taught to surrender. From the moment they could walk, the daughters of the dynasty were reminded of their difference. Tutors came not merely to instruct them in letters and sciences, but to shape them into emblems of dynastic prestige. Their education was polished but never liberating. Each lesson, each word reinforced their role as bargaining chips. They learned to bow, to speak, to serve at table, not because they were destined to serve their father, but because they were destined to be given away. The contrast was painful. In the same courtyards, slave girls could whisper to one another about possibilities. Perhaps the Sultan's gaze would fall upon them. Perhaps they would bear a son and secure status that could alter the course of empire. But princesses whispered nothing. Their lives were not gambles, they were chains. The Sultan's daughters would never win influence through charm. Their fate was already decided by counsel, by scribes, by the needs of empire. To the empire's bureaucracy, they were not individuals, but assets. Records survive of princesses promised in marriage long before they came of age. Generals too ambitious, governors too independent. These men were tamed not only with titles and stipends, but with a living chain, the hand of a royal daughter. The man gained prestige and proximity to power. The girl lost everything. And yet, even as these daughters bore the burden of flesh alliances, concubines, the women once captured in war or bought in markets sometimes mocked them in secret. For they knew that while their own fates were uncertain, they at least retained agency within the narrow world of the harem. They could scheme, seduce, betray, rise or fall. The princesses could do none of these things. They were prisoners of certainty, bound not by chains of iron, but by chains of obligation. It is in this paradox that Fatma Sultan's tragedy was born. From childhood, her brilliance shone like a flame, but brilliance was no shield. Chroniclers recall her delight in watching the stars with palace astronomers, her skill in debate with tutors. But every book she read, every constellation she traced, led her not to freedom, but to the same endpoint, a political marriage. Her name reduced to a footnote in a treaty. The cruel irony of empire was this: the daughters born in gilded cradles were far less free than the women bought in the slave markets. By the time Fatma reached adolescence, whispers of her future had already circulated through the palace corridors. She was to be given to Kara Mustafa Pasha, a seasoned commander scarred by Persian wars 2 decades her senior. To him, the marriage was not a union of souls, but a ladder of power. To her, it was the extinguishing of the little girl who once gazed at the stars. Every Ottoman princess lived this reality. They were not brides, but bargaining chips their youth consumed to stabilize a dynasty. And if they resisted, resistance was not even a possibility. The machinery of empire had already prepared them for obedience, through rituals that stripped away pride, through humiliations designed to break the spirit before the wedding night ever arrived. For Fatma, as for so many before her, being a daughter of the Sultan did not mean privilege. It meant she was currency in human form. Months before Princess Fatma Sultan's wedding, the palace walls seemed to close in around her. What should have been a time of anticipation was instead the beginning of her undoing. She was placed into the process known as Turbi Mubarak, the sacred training. Outsiders hearing the phrase might have imagined ritual blessings, perhaps prayers for fertility or lessons in etiquette, befitting a royal bride. But behind the closed doors of Topkapi Palace, its meaning was far darker. It was not a preparation for marriage. It was a dismantling of the self. The training began with the body. At dawn, Fatma was led into chambers adorned with Persian carpets, mirrors, and incense. Yet beneath the surface, beauty lay precision in cruelty. She was drilled in endless bows, 18 in total, each with its precise angle, depth, and duration. There were bows for greeting her husband, bows for asking forgiveness, bows for serving guests, bows even for walking into a room. If her movement faltered, if her angle was wrong by a single degree, punishment followed immediately. Sometimes it was fasting without food until her knees buckled. Other times, it was hours of standing in silence with arms outstretched until she shook with exhaustion. Her voice too was stripped. From a child who once conversed with scholars in multiple languages, she was reduced to 43 permitted words: gratitude, apology, requests phrased in obedience. Any deviation, any hint of independent thought was considered rebellion. If she spoke too freely, she was locked in the rooms of reflection damp cells beneath the palace, where the air smelled of mildew and silence pressed down like a weight. There she would remain until tears blurred her vision and hunger hollowed her body. The cruelty was deliberate. Fatma was not only being prepared to be a bride, she was being remade into a vessel of surrender. Overseers like Gola Hatun, chief of the harem, measured each moment of defiance, recording them in ledgers as if tallying accounts. A bowed head marked progress. A sob marked success. The training extended beyond gestures and words into humiliation. Twice a week, Fatma was forced to serve her father's concubines, the very women who shared the Sultan's bed. She washed them, combed their hair, dressed them for evenings of pleasure. Witnesses recorded her tears as she buttoned gowns or adjusted veils, her pride broken by the demand to obey women who owed their place, not to birth, but to seduction. The symbolism was clear. A princess, though born into glory, had no dignity of her own. Even her father's lovers stood above her in the hierarchy of submission. Psychological conditioning accompanied physical ritual. Fatma was ordered to memorize passages from Ottoman treatises, exalting obedience and sacrifice, reciting them before stern audiences of eunuchs and senior women. Her prayers, once a private devotion, were rewritten into chants of surrender invocations, praising silence, humility, and wifely duty. Religion itself became a chain sanctifying her submission. The overseers understood that breaking the spirit required constant reminders. Mirrors lined the training chambers, forcing Fatma to confront her own reflection endlessly. Her posture, her hands even. Her eyes were scrutinized not only by instructors, but by herself. The technique, once a Sufi meditation practice called muraqabah, was twisted into psychological torture. Where once mystics sought union with the divine Fatma, was forced to monitor her every gesture for errors of obedience. Each day blurred into the next bow's silence. Humiliation, fasting, isolation. The girl who had once dreamed of the stars began to disappear. Chroniclers noted her laughter vanished, her gaze dulled. She still recited poetry when commanded, still displayed her knowledge of history when tested, but the spark had dimmed. The sacred training was working, yet the most insidious cruelty lay in the illusions of honor woven into the process. Overseers spoke of purity of preparing her body and soul for sacred union. Ritual baths were performed, her skin anointed with fragrant oils, her meals adjusted with pomegranates, almonds, and honey foods believed to strengthen and purify. But beneath this veneer of ritual lay the true purpose to crush resistance to engineer obedience so total that when the wedding night arrived, she would no longer have a will of her own. By the time weeks turned to months, Fatma's brilliance had been dimmed into shadow. She walked with measured steps, her head inclined at the prescribed 30 degrees. She spoke only the permitted words whispered with downcast eyes. She served concubines without protest, even when humiliation burned her cheeks. To the overseers, this was victory. To Fatma, it was erasure. Turbi Mubarak did not create brides. It created prisoners who wore bridal veils. And so, as the date of her wedding approached, Fatma Sultan was no longer the radiant girl who debated scholars or traced constellations in the night sky. She had become the empire's sculpted shadow, an ornament of obedience. Her spirit broken long before her marriage had even begun. Beneath the gilded pavilions of Topkapi, below the courtyards, perfumed with jasmine and guarded by towering gates, lay a hidden world few ever saw. It was here, in cold underground chambers, lit only by oil lamps, that the final stage of Fatma Sultan's preparation unfolded. The empire called it rehearsal. In truth, it was theatre designed to annihilate resistance before it could ever reach the marriage bed. The chambers were built to mirror bridal rooms in uncanny detail. Low couches, draped silks, carpets underfoot, and mirrors positioned at every angle. Yet, unlike a true chamber of celebration, these rooms carried no warmth, no joy. Instead, they housed wax mannequins crafted by Venetian artisans, carved with uncanny precision into the shapes of men. Some were painted with stern expressions, others left blank their facelessness, more terrifying than detail. Fatma was forced to approach them as if they were husbands, repeating bows gestures and postures of submission. She practiced lying still, practiced serving wine, practiced responding to touch. Each tremor, each hesitation was recorded by overseers who stood hidden behind screens. The ritual had a rhythm as cruel as any battlefield drill. At dawn, Fatma was led down into the chamber. She was commanded to kneel before the mannequin, to lower her gaze, to extend her hands in feigned offering. If her fingers shook, she was struck with a rod of reed. If she flinched at the cold wax against her skin, she was ordered to repeat the act until the tremor stilled. The mannequin was unfeeling, but the lesson was real. Her body was not her own. It belonged to the empire to be rehearsed, corrected and controlled until no resistance remained. Psychological weapons sharpened the cruelty. Fasting was imposed before sessions, ensuring weakness softened her will. Fatma entered the chambers, light-headed, her body trembling with hunger. In that state, the commands cut deeper, her capacity to resist drained by fatigue. If she faltered too greatly, she was locked in isolation cells afterward. Narrow stone closets, known as reflection rooms, where she could neither stand fully upright nor lie down without pain. Hours in darkness pressed her into silence until obedience seemed the only path to release. Mirrors intensified the torment. Positioned at sharp angles, they reflected her image, endlessly multiplying her body into dozens of spectral selves. There was no escape from her own reflection. If her posture slipped, she saw it magnified. If her tears fell, they appeared 100-fold. What once might have been a mystical exercise, muraqabah, used by Sufi mystics to contemplate divine presence, became an instrument of self-surveillance. Fatma learned not only to obey others, but to police herself. Every aspect of the rehearsal was calculated. Even the scents in the chamber rose. Water musk, bitter herbs were chosen to anchor the rituals in memory. The goal was conditioning that the faintest trace of those perfumes on her wedding night would summon obedience before thought could intervene. The empire was building reflexes, not rituals. The overseer of these rehearsals, Golar Hatun, spoke rarely, but when she did, her words cut like knives. A princess is not a bride, she told Fatma once. She is a contract signed in flesh. Your duty is not to yourself, but to the empire. To resist was to defy not merely a father or a husband, but the machinery of dynasty itself. Fatma's tears were frequent, yet they counted for little. In the ledgers kept by eunuchs, they were tallies of progress, proof that the sacred training was taking hold. The more she wept, the more convinced her overseers became that her spirit was bending toward obedience. To them, sorrow was success. The rehearsals stretched for weeks, then months. Slowly, fatigue and repetition did their work. Fatma no longer flinched at the mannequins. She no longer fought when ordered to recite chants of submission. She bowed without hesitation, moved with mechanical precision, spoke only the permitted phrases. The girl who once debated scholars and gazed at the stars was dissolving piece by piece into the mold of a bride sculpted for surrender. And yet fragments of her still flickered beneath the surface. In whispered moments between sessions, she recalled verses of Persian poetry lines about freedom, about the soul's flight beyond the body. Sometimes she traced constellations in the air with her fingers, invisible stars that only she could see. These were sparks of defiance, fragile and fleeting. But within the machinery of the palace, even sparks were swiftly smothered. The rehearsals culminated in the ritual of silence. Fatma was placed in the chamber for an entire night alone with the mannequins, no overseers present. Food and water were withheld. She was told to remain kneeling, to speak no word, to endure the suffocating quiet. By morning, when the overseers returned, she was too weak to stand. They lifted her, noted her collapse, and declared the ritual complete. The empire's ledger marked her ready. From the gilded halls above, the people of Istanbul saw only the preparations for a grand wedding. Caravans of gift silks, arriving from Bursa, jewels from Persia, spices from Yemen. But beneath those same halls, in the cold stone chambers of rehearsal, a young girl's spirit had already been broken. The wedding had not yet arrived yet. The defeat was already complete. The bride's pavilion was spoken of as a jewel within Topkapi, a sanctuary of refinement meant to crown the destiny of a princess. From the gardens it seemed flawless, white marble, shining against the Bosporus, carved lattice windows, spilling filtered light across silken carpets, the scent of jasmine drifting from courtyards tended by dozens of gardeners. Chroniclers praised it as the pinnacle of Ottoman artistry, a chamber built for honor. Yet, when Fatma Sultan crossed its threshold, she stepped not into honor, but into captivity. Behind its gilded screens, every object, every ritual, every gesture had been repurposed into a chain. Her days in the pavilion followed a rhythm designed not by affection, but by calculation. At dawn, servants arrived with trays that looked like gifts bowls of pomegranate seeds, gleaming like rubies, honey dripping from combs of Anatolian bees, goat's milk served in crystal ewers. Yet, these were not delicacies chosen for delight. They were prescriptions. Physicians of the palace, schooled in ancient humoral theory, measured her meals to balance temperaments, to pacify resistance, and to prime her body for fertility. Almonds were thought to sharpen obedient saffron, to lighten mood poppy seeds, to dim the mind. What seemed like nourishment was, in truth, the slow dosing of compliance. The baths were no refuge either. Water perfumed with rose and ambergris was poured over her skin in ceremonies that imitated luxury. Yet the oils rubbed into her flesh were tinctures of valerian bitter orange and mandrake root herbs believed to still the will and quiet the nerves. What should have been moments of relaxation became rehearsals in passivity. Attendants observed every movement, how she lowered her head, how she spread her arms, how long she remained silent. Even bathing was a lesson in submission. Clothing finished what food and water began. Fatma's bridal gown was a masterpiece stitched by the finest seamstresses of the empire. From a distance, it glittered white silk, shot through with golden thread pearls and emeralds woven into elaborate patterns. But the beauty concealed a hidden cruelty. The crown was so heavy, her head bowed without choice. Cords sewn into the lining restricted her arms, ensuring her posture bent in ways prescribed by custom. The shoes, elevated on stiff soles, turned walking into a halting shuffle. To the world, she would appear radiant, but every stitch and clasp reminded her that she no longer moved of her own accord. The garments were prisons disguised as honors. The pavilion itself conspired in her reshaping. Its walls were draped not with images of nature or triumph, but with woven tableaus of women idealized for silence. Eyes lowered, mouths closed, hands folded, embroidered saints of submission stared at her in endless repetition. Mirrors multiplied the lesson. Venetian glass angled with precision trapped her reflection from every direction. Wherever she turned, she found herself gazing back, an endless echo of a figure already being hollowed. She was forced to confront her own transformation until she began to internalize it. Privacy. Once the refuge of the self no longer existed, even the air carried the weight of discipline. The rooms were filled with subtle fragrances, crafted by court alchemist cinnamon to quicken blood lavender, to soothe musk, to inflame, and poppy resin to subdue. Each breath she drew was a cocktail of intent, binding her body closer to the destiny chosen for her. Nightfall brought no relief. Lamps of bronze and crystal glowed through scented smoke. But the pavilion's silence was thick, punctuated only by the footsteps of eunuchs who patrolled the outer corridors. She was not alone. Yet she had never felt more imprisoned. This was the paradox of the bride's pavilion. Outwardly a place of privilege, inwardly a mechanism of control. For the empire, Fatma was not a daughter to be cherished, but a coin of flesh, minted for politics. Every ritual of her confinement reinforced that truth. She was bathed not as a bride, but as an offering. Dressed not as a woman, but as a vessel. Fed not as a living person, but as dynastic capital. As weeks passed, the walls seemed to close around her. The girl who had once debated astronomy with tutors now spent her days staring into mirrors, reciting verses of obedience, and learning to breathe quietly enough to go unnoticed. By the time the wedding procession approached, the pavilion had succeeded. Fatma Sultan no longer looked out from its windows as a princess filled with curiosity and brilliance. She looked out as a shadow draped in silk, waiting for the night that would seal her fate. The night that should have been a celebration of new beginnings was in truth the final act of Fatma Sultan's unmaking. Istanbul roared with festivities that March evening in 1623. Musicians played in the streets, torches lit the Bosporus, and feasts spilled across courtyards where nobles and commoners alike praised the empire's glory. To the outside world, this was a union blessed by heaven, the marriage of a princess to one of the empire's most trusted commanders. But inside the Gurdic odor, the nuptial chamber, another truth unfolded, one never meant to reach the ears of history. The chamber itself was designed like a fortress of symbolism. Octagonal in shape, its architecture mimicked cosmological order, 8 walls for 8 horizons, the ceiling painted with constellations, the floor inlaid with marble patterns representing the empire's dominion over earth and sky. Yet, behind the art lay menace. Tapestries on the walls depicted not scenes of love, but of conquest. Ottoman armies trampling cities, chained captives led before sultans. Women presented as tribute. Every image reinforced the same message. This night was not about union, but about submission, not love, but domination. Fatma entered the chamber draped in silks that glittered like a crown. Yet each jewel felt like a weight, each thread another binding. Her crown pulled her head down. Her bracelets bit into her wrists. The gown's hidden cords restricted her movements. She was adorned like a queen, but carried herself like a prisoner already condemned. Chroniclers later described her steps as halting, her complexion pale, her eyes unfocused. Palace physicians noted what we would today recognize as panic sweat across her forehead, despite the cool spring night, trembling hands, lips, whispering prayers too faint to be heard. Her husband Kara Mustafa Pasha entered with the confidence of a man groomed by both war and ritual. He had been instructed not merely in the duties of marriage, but in methods of dominance. Advisors and eunuchs had prepared him with phrases to assert power gestures, to establish control strategies, to break any resistance. To him, this chamber was not a bridal suite, but a battlefield where he must conquer his wife as he would an enemy citadel. The Empire had trained both bride and groom for this encounter, leaving no space for love, only the mechanics of control. As the doors closed behind them, silence enveloped the room. Outside, the last echoes of music faded. Inside, only the sound of Fatma's ragged breathing remained. She tried to steady herself, but months of sacred training had already hollowed her spirit. Every humiliation, every forced bow, every night of isolation had carved into her mind the inevitability of surrender. When the moment came, she had no words left, no gestures of refusal, only silence and tears. Mustafa misread that silence. Believing it pride, he responded as he had been taught, with harsh words, meant to break arrogance with calculated gestures of authority. He mistook her trembling for defiance, her stillness for resistance. But what stood before him was not defiance at all. It was absence. Fatma had retreated inward, her body present, but her soul already fleeing. The records of the palace physicians written in cryptic Persian notes describe what followed with chilling detachment. Hemorrhages, fainting fits, what they called ruh sukmei, the flight of the soul. She collapsed repeatedly, slipping into unconsciousness, waking only to sob uncontrollably. Her body shook with spasms, her breath came shallow, and more than once, she whispered incoherently as though speaking to some world beyond the chamber. The doctors later labeled it virginal melancholy, a phrase that masked the reality of trauma so profound it could not be named in the language of the court. By dawn, the union had been consummated in the empire's ledgers, but for Fatma Sultan, something far greater had been destroyed. She emerged from the nuptial chamber, not as the brilliant girl who had debated scholars and gazed at the stars, but as a hollowed figure. Chroniclers observe that she barely spoke in the days that followed, eating little, weeping often, staring at the ground for hours. Servants reported she startled at the sound of footsteps, flinched at the presence of men, even eunuchs. What the empire saw as a successful marriage was in truth the death of a spirit. And yet her tragedy was recorded only in fragments, coded notes, in physicians' journals, whispers preserved in hidden archives. Official chronicles spoke of her wedding as a triumph of dynastic stability, a gift to the empire. They celebrated the political ladder her husband had climbed, the alliances secured, the continuity of power. Nowhere did they speak of the girl who had collapsed on her wedding night, nor of the silence that consumed her life thereafter. Rome had once written that victory required sacrifice. The Ottomans too followed that creed. And here the sacrifice was Fatma Sultan herself. In the empire's grand narrative, her pain did not exist. But her scream, first heard that early morning in 1623, still echoes through the silence of history, a cry that reminds us that behind every gilded wall of power lies the shadow of those who paid its hidden price. The wedding night was supposed to mark Fatma Sultan's elevation from daughter of the empire to pillar of its alliances. Instead, it marked her quiet disappearance. In the official ledgers, she appears as wife of Kara Mustafa Pasha, a union described in lines of bureaucratic triumph. Yet, between those neat entries, the traces of her existence fade into shadows. In the immediate aftermath, palace physicians noted her trembling hands, sudden collapses, and stretches of silence that stretched for hours. They named it virginal melancholy, a phrase meant to conceal trauma behind the veil of medical respectability. In truth, it was the soul retreating inward. Fatma stopped speaking except when pressed. Even then, her words were no longer her own whispers of apology, murmurs of obedience. Fragments of the script drilled into her during months of sacred training. To the outside world, she remained visible. She appeared at ceremonies draped in silk, her face painted into stillness, her posture flawless. The court chroniclers praised her beauty, her poise, her role as dutiful wife. But in the corridors of the palace, servants whispered of the other Fatma, the one who wandered gardens at night, eyes unfocused, pausing before fountains, as if waiting for some forgotten companion. Her tutors, who once marveled at her quick grasp of astronomy, now watched her ignore the manuscripts left in her chambers, their pages gathering dust. Her husband Kara Mustafa Pasha, a man seasoned by war, struggled in his own way. He had expected resistance, even rebellion, and had been trained in how to crush it. But he found no fire left to extinguish. What he saw instead was absence. Sources from the period suggest he buried his guilt in military campaigns and opium smoke, throwing himself into the empire's endless wars, as if distance could free him from the silence he returned to at home. The silence became Fatma's companion. Meals went untouched. Songs that once delighted her were met with indifference. She was often carried from ceremonies after fainting spells, her body frail, her spirit hollow. Physicians recorded their attempts, herbal concoctions of saffron and rosewater, opium drafts to calm her nerves. Music therapy with flutes and strings played softly by eunuchs. None of it restored the girl who once debated philosophy with scholars and dreamed of constellations. For 29 years, Fatma lived in this twilight state, present but not whole. She bore children fulfilling her dynastic duty. Though even this is recorded in detached tones, the birth of heirs noted as triumphs of bloodline without mention of the mother's voice or suffering. Her identity was dissolved into function. Her children belonged not to her, but to the empire raised as instruments of policy. She remained their mother in name, only her role overshadowed by nurses, tutors, and overseers of court protocol. Palace officials continued to write of her as a jewel in ceremonies, a silent presence at feasts, a figure positioned carefully in processions. She became an ornament of dynasty, rather than a living woman. And yet, the fragments that slip through letters, from foreign envoys passing comments by courtiers, hint at the toll beneath the surface. One ambassador described her as a woman of great beauty, but eyes that never meet one's gaze, as if fixed upon another world. Fatma's decline mirrored the paradox of the harem itself. To the public imagination, it was a realm of luxury and desire, the beating heart of Ottoman power. In reality, for women like Fatma, it was a labyrinth of silence. Every room designed to reflect obedience. Every ritual engineered to erode the will. The palace had succeeded in shaping her into a vessel of submission, but in the process, it extinguished the brilliance that once made her unique. When Fatma died in 1652, at the age of 46, the official cause was recorded as fever. Yet, the timing on the anniversary of her marriage was too sharp for coincidence. Within the palace, whispers spread that she had not died of illness, but of memory, the weight of decades finally crushing her spirit. Her funeral was conducted with pomp. Drums echoed through Istanbul. Prayers rose in the mosques. Officials spoke of her as dutiful wife and mother. The empire closed the ledger of her life with dignity. But the truth lingered in silence. The girl who once studied stars, who wrote poetry in the margins of her tutor's books, had been erased long before her body was buried. Fatma Sultan's life in shadow was not an exception, but a pattern. Her story illuminates the machinery of empire, how even its own daughters could be consumed by its hunger for obedience, alliances, and control. She was both visible and invisible, displayed as a symbol of glory while quietly expunged of self. In her silence, we hear not just her tragedy, but the tragedy of countless women whose names and dreams were lost behind gilded walls. Fatma Sultan's life in shadow was not unique. Her silence was part of a pattern carefully maintained by the empire, one that stretched across generations, and was only uncovered centuries later when fragments of the Ottoman archives began to surface. These scattered papers, marginal notes, and whispered testimonies revealed that what happened to Fatma was repeated over and over, as if each princess were following a script written long before her birth. The rediscovered records speak of dozens of women whose names flicker like candlelight in forgotten ledgers. Some resisted, others disappeared. Many were broken in silence. One file tells of a princess who tried to escape her fate by feigning illness, claiming a wasting disease that made her unfit for marriage. When physicians discovered her ruse, the punishment was swift weeks of isolation in underground cells, until her cries faded into resignation. Another case describes two sisters who invented a secret code of gestures, used across the walls of their confinement to communicate the words they were forbidden to say aloud. Their defiance survived only in a single eunuch's memoir, preserved by chance. Suicides were quietly recorded, but never acknowledged as acts of rebellion. Annotations in court reports mention young women who fell from balconies or succumbed to melancholy. The euphemisms barely hide the truth that some princesses chose death rather than submission. Others tried to carve slivers of agency by petitioning directly to the Sultan. A few courageous daughters sent letters begging for divorce or reassignment, daring to confront the machinery of empire. Most of those pleas were denied. Some vanished from the records entirely, as though erased for daring to speak. The pattern was systematic. Unlike concubines who could gamble for power through intrigue, Ottoman princesses were pieces on the board of diplomacy. Their marriages sealed alliances with powerful viziers, generals, or governors. They were coins of flesh minted for political exchange. Resistance was not merely disobedience. It was seen as treason against the dynasty itself. The empire invested enormous effort into ensuring their silence, because silence guaranteed stability. What makes these stories haunting is the empire's skill in erasure. The Ottoman bureaucracy was meticulous, yet, when it came to the suffering of royal daughters, it turned selective. Official chronicles highlight their marriages, their dowries, their processions, but omit their cries, their illnesses, their suicides. Whole lives are compressed into ceremonial entries. She was given to so-and-so and bore children, nothing more. And yet, in the margins, their humanity leaks through. A courtier notes that one princess wept uncontrollably during her bridal procession. Another mentions a girl who mutilated her own face in a desperate attempt to avoid marriage, hoping her scars would spare her from being used as a pawn. Parents too appear in these fragments. Some mothers tried bribery, offering jewels or estates in exchange for sparing their daughters. Others hid their children within palace quarters, delaying the inevitable until discovery brought harsher punishment. Patterns emerge even in the silences. The empire was skilled at presenting continuity, each generation's princess fulfilling her role as though willingly. But the rediscovered files reveal Rupture's acts of quiet sabotage and unrecorded grief. They show how the system, while designed to erase individuality, could never fully extinguish resistance. Even in silence, gestures carried meaning. Even in captivity, codes of survival were invented. For historians, these fragments are invaluable. They transform abstract structures of empire into lived human stories. They reveal the costs hidden behind alliances and ceremonies, the invisible currency of obedience demanded from daughters of the dynasty. And they remind us that Fatma's tragedy was not an isolated tale of one unlucky princess, but part of a machine that consumed generations. The archives, though partial, confront us with a moral question. If this was the fate of the daughters of sultans, the most privileged women of the empire, what then of the nameless concubines, the enslaved girls brought from Circassia, the Balkans, Africa? If even royal blood could not shield Fatma from the empire's hunger for obedience, what chance did the powerless have? In these patterns, we begin to see not just history, but a blueprint of control. The Ottoman Empire was not alone in practicing it. Other dynasties across the world mirrored similar systems. But in the harem's silence, sharpened across centuries, we see its most refined form. A theatre where women were trained to vanish into roles, their resistance reduced to faint traces in the margins of forgotten ledgers. To the outside world, the Ottoman princess was a symbol of unimaginable splendor. Painters across Europe imagined them reclining on velvet cushions, attended by servants, their lives drenched in jewels, perfumes, and poetry. Travelers returning from Istanbul spoke in awed tones of gilded courtyards, fountains that sang, and halls perfumed with rose water. The word harem itself became shorthand for exotic luxury, a dreamscape of silks and shadows where beauty reigned and desire whispered through painted screens. But the truth beneath the mask was far colder. The harem was not a place of freedom, it was a system of surveillance and control. Every gesture, every glance, every word spoken by its inhabitants was observed, weighed, and recorded. Its walls were designed not to keep men out, but to keep women in. Behind the illusions of luxury lay a machinery of obedience so precise that it could turn daughters of emperors into shadows of themselves. The fairy tale hid the reality of ritualized humiliation. What looked like a palace of pleasures was for many a prison of submission. The silks that clothed Fatma Sultan were not gifts of beauty, but instruments of restraint. The mirrors that lined her chambers did not reflect freedom, but reminded her of her confinement. The tapestries embroidered with stories of obedient wives were not decoration, but indoctrination stitched into fabric. Even the feasts and perfumes were chosen not for indulgence, but for their symbolic power in reshaping body and mind toward surrender. Western observers who were permitted brief glimpses into the harem often mistook its structure. They saw hundreds of women jewels, glittering laughter spilling into corridors, and believed it a paradise of indulgence. What they did not see were the isolation cells beneath the palace, the mannequins used in rehearsals of submission, or the secret codes invented by sisters to communicate when their voices were stolen. They did not see the tears during bridal processions, the fainting spells, or the suicides erased from official records. The illusion was carefully maintained by the empire itself. The harem had to appear as a jewel of Ottoman power, a place where royal daughters lived in glory. To reveal the truth would have been to expose a contradiction at the heart of the dynasty, that its splendor was built not only on conquest abroad, but on conquest within. And so the mask endured. Painters painted silks, not chains. Chroniclers recorded marriages, not screams. Foreign ambassadors described intrigue, but not despair. And yet the fragments we now uncover reveal a different story. The harem was a theatre of silence. Its stage was adorned with beauty, but its script was written in obedience. Each princess became a performer in a play designed to preserve dynastic stability. Their lives were reduced to symbols, their voices muted, their individuality erased. The empire's survival demanded this sacrifice, and the machinery of control ensured it was repeated generation after generation. The contrast between mask and reality forces us to ask how many civilizations have done the same. How many palaces in Europe, Russia, China told the world of fairy tales while their daughters were bound in rituals too dark to write down? The harem is not an exotic exception, it is a mirror. Its silks and perfumes concealed what every empire preferred to hide. That power demands obedience, and obedience often begins with the silencing of women. The mask of civilization remains seductive. Tourists still walk through Topkapi Palace today, marveling at its domes and gardens, imagining a world of beauty and intrigue. Few realize that beneath those very floors were chambers of humiliation, mirrors of obedience, and the tears of girls whose names history barely remembers. The fairy tale has outlived the women themselves, and unless we peel back the mask, the reality will remain buried, while the silence continues to echo. The fate of Ottoman princesses was not an isolated cruelty, nor was the harem's machinery of control unique to Istanbul. Across empires and centuries, dynastic daughters were currency. In the marketplace of power, their bodies turned into treaties, their silence pressed into the mortar of empire. The pattern is unmistakable once you look closely beneath the gilded facades of royal courts in Europe. Russia, China lay rituals of submission, often too dark to be written in chronicles, too shameful to be remembered in legend. In Europe, princesses were coins minted in bloodlines. A daughter of the Habsburgs might be sent to France at 15, her dowry measured in territories and soldiers. Her education was precise music etiquette and the art of concealing misery. Letters smuggled from convents and palaces reveal young women who described themselves as sacrifices upon the altar of peace. Marie Antoinette, sent from Austria to France, recorded in her early correspondence that she was a lamb dressed in silk handed to strangers to secure alliances. Her story, though dramatized by her later fall, was in truth typical of dynastic daughters whose personal desires were erased beneath state necessity. In Russia, the machinery of control took harsher forms. The daughters of Tsars were kept within the terem, a secluded upper-floor prison of the palace, where their lives were scripted from birth. Marriage was arranged to secure alliances with boyars or foreign rulers, and refusal was unthinkable. Chroniclers mention the terror of Sophia Alexeyevna, a brilliant girl of the 17th century who watched her sisters vanish into marriages that resembled cages. For many, the wedding day was not liberation, but confinement in new chains, this time under the gaze of husbands chosen by politics, not affection. And in China, the Forbidden City held its own theatre of submission. imperial daughters of the Ming and Qing dynasties, lived within red-walled palaces, groomed not for choice, but for obedience. Some were married off to Mongol or Manchu nobles, their lives dissolving into exile for the sake of border stability. Others were bound to rituals of restraint that began in childhood, foot-binding endless recitations of obedience classics and ceremonies that framed their bodies as symbols of harmony between heaven and earth. To the outside world, they were living jewels of dynastic order. Inside, they were sacrifices to the same machinery of power. What unites these stories is not geography, but silence. The chroniclers almost always men wrote of alliances' triumphs and dynasties preserved. They rarely wrote of the daughters who paid the price. We know their names in passing, sometimes only as bride of or daughter of, their individuality erased. It is only through fragments, letters hidden in archives, whispered codes discovered centuries later, the architecture of palaces that reveal confinement, that their voices flicker back into the light. This universality should unsettle us. It tells us that Fatma Sultan's scream in Topkapı Palace was not just an Ottoman tragedy, it was part of a global pattern. The gilded cage in Istanbul had mirrors in Vienna, Moscow, and Beijing. The rituals differed, but the logic was the same. Dynastic daughters were expendable, their obedience a matter of state survival. Their childhoods were short. Their laughter silenced their fates, mapped onto contracts signed long before they could write their own names. And yet, amid the silence, hints of resistance emerge. In Europe, princesses who smuggled secret letters, daring to write of misery. In Russia, Sofia Alexeyevna herself, who briefly seized power and ruled as regent, breaking the cage for a moment. In China, some imperial daughters cultivated poetry and calligraphy as a way to inscribe their voices into eternity, even if their bodies were trapped. These flickers remind us that silence was never total. Even in gilded cages, sparks of defiance glowed. The echoes across dynasties force us to ask how many voices have been lost to the machinery of power. How many stories remain buried beneath official chronicles? And what does it say about us that we still prefer the fairy tale, the silks, the palaces, the glittering weddings, over the truth of what those women endured? Because once we recognize the universality of their suffering, history looks different. The harem was not an exotic anomaly. It was a mirror reflecting what courts everywhere preferred to hide, that power, without compassion, devours its daughters first. When the palace gates close, when the chronicles end, what remains are fragments. Screams caught in stone corridors, poems scratched into margins, bones buried beneath gilded walls. Princess Fatma Sultan's story is only one voice, one name among hundreds that never reached us. Her scream in 1623 echoes across centuries, not as a relic of the Ottoman harem alone, but as a symbol of what dynasties demanded from their daughters: silence, obedience, and sacrifice. The empire she served did not call it cruelty. It called it order ritual, sacred preparation. The court doctors gave it Latin names. Philosophers rationalized it as necessity. Chroniclers veiled it as destiny. Yet, strip away the silks, the ceremonies, the ornate architecture, and what remains is the simple truth. Power without compassion feeds upon its own blood. Fatma lived another 29 years after that night, a hollow ornament of the court. Outwardly, she fulfilled her role, appearing at ceremonies bearing children standing at her husband's side. But in the shadows, she faded into mutism, depression and despair. Her brilliance was extinguished before it had the chance to shine. Multiply her silence by generations, and you glimpse the true cost of empire, a ledger written not in coin, but in stolen lives. The tragedy is not confined to the Ottomans. Europe's princesses who signed their youth away in political contracts, Russia's daughters hidden in the harem, China's imperial girls bound in silks and silence. Across cultures, across centuries, the pattern repeats. History celebrated dynasties, but it buried their daughters. We inherited palaces, manuscripts, and monuments, but their voices, their laughter, their tears were left to vanish. This silence is not innocent. It is deliberate. Historians praised kings, generals, and empire builders, while leaving women like Fatma unnamed, reduced to titles, daughter of, wife of, bride of. Their individuality erased, their suffering dismissed as footnotes. Even today, their stories are told piecemeal, hidden behind myths of romance, exoticism, or luxury. But the truth is sharper. The harem was not just a place of intrigue. It was also a theatre of control, a factory of silence. And yet to remember them is to resist erasure. To say their names, to trace their fragments, to reimagine their voices, is to restore humanity to the historical record. The story of Fatma Sultan is not simply one of despair. It is also a call to strip history of its disguises, to peel away the silks, and to confront the bones beneath. Because civilizations are not measured only by the roads they built, the books they wrote, or the palaces they raised. They are measured by how they treated their most vulnerable. Rome, the Ottomans, the dynasties of Europe and Asia, all remind us that glory often hides a ledger of blood. So let us end not with silence, but with remembrance. The cry of Fatma Sultan, recorded in fragments, stands for all the cries erased. The statues survived, the chronicles survived, the rituals survived, but their voices did not. Now we listen.